What does it take to summon the FBI, the Department of Energy, and elite bomb disposal squads to a perfectly ordinary, boring suburban backyard? Is it a cartel safe house? A hidden terrorist cell? A military-grade weapons cache? No, it takes a teenager. A high school kid who flipped burgers at a fast food joint. While other boys his age were worried about passing their math tests or talking to girls, this specific teenager had a slightly different goal in mind. He wanted to split the atom. Welcome back to the World Time Capsule. Today, we are opening the file on one of the most terrifying, absurd, and completely true scientific disasters in modern history. The story of David Hahn, the teenager who built a fully functioning nuclear reactor in his mother's wooden potting shed. Our story begins on October 30th, 1976, in the state of Michigan. Little David Hahn was born into a world that would soon split in two. When he was just a toddler, his parents divorced, completely fracturing his life. From that moment on, David was bounced back and forth, living halfway between his father's house and his mother's house. But the true catalyst of this terrifying butterfly effect was not the divorce itself. It was a simple, seemingly innocent gift given to him by his oblivious parents. It was called the Golden Book of Chemistry Experiments, a relic from the 1960s. This book contained over 200 do-it-yourself chemical experiments designed to be performed at home. Now, you must remember, in the 1960s, concepts like child safety or health regulations were apparently just funny suggestions. Handing this book to a child was essentially handing them a manual for homemade destruction. But for young David, this dangerous little book was a revelation. It grabbed his complete, undivided attention. And as the years passed, this innocent curiosity mutated into an absolute, uncontrollable obsession. By the time David was 12 years old, he had completely bypassed normal childhood literature. He was actively reading advanced college-level chemistry textbooks. He wasn't receiving any special education or tutoring. He was entirely self-taught, driven by a relentless manic determination to experiment. When he was just 14 years old, he established his very first laboratory right inside his bedroom at his father's house. And the results? Exactly what you would expect. His room became ground zero for a series of minor explosions and toxic chemical spills. Yet, his father remained completely oblivious to the danger. He simply thought his son was showing initiative, educating himself. He was actually proud. It was only after a few too many loud bangs that his father finally issued a mild warning, forcing David to move his highly volatile laboratory down into the basement. David, of course, was absolutely thrilled. The basement was dark, isolated, and hidden from prying eyes. It was the perfect evil lair. Down in that basement, spending 2 full years experimenting in secret, this 14-year-old boy managed to synthesize nitroglycerin. Yes, the highly unstable explosive liquid used in dynamite. And when a teenager successfully creates nitroglycerin in a suburban basement without blowing his own arms off, his confidence naturally skyrockets to terrifying levels. While he was brilliant at science, he completely failed at almost every other subject in school. To fund his increasingly dangerous experiments, he took jobs as a sales clerk and a fast food worker. He was flipping burgers to fund his descent into madness. You see, David had a grand, terrifying goal. He wanted to possess every single element on the periodic table. And yes, that included the highly radioactive ones. But simply collecting them wasn't enough. He wanted to build an atomic weapon he called a neutron gun. The warning signs were everywhere. One day, his father found him lying completely unconscious on the basement floor. David had been conducting a reckless experiment, combining the tip of a screwdriver with red phosphorus, creating a cloud of toxic fumes that knocked him out cold. His father woke him up, gave him a stern talking to, and said, "If you do this again, I will hang you from the ceiling by your legs." But did he shut down the lab? No. He simply banished David to his mother's house. His mother, entirely clueless about the magnitude of the danger, struck a deal with him. She told David he could continue his little experiments in her backyard shed, but only on one condition: he had to socialize. She forced him to join the Boy Scouts. She thought the wholesome, disciplined environment of the Boy Scouts would keep him out of trouble. But it was inside that very Boy Scout troop that David would earn his atomic energy badge. A badge that would grant him access to the exact classified brochures he needed to build a functional nuclear reactor. David had finally achieved the impossible. He had successfully built a working nuclear reactor core in his mother's backyard, using nothing but common household items, stolen smoke detectors, and a terrifying amount of sheer willpower. However, no matter how reckless or blinded by scientific ambition he was, even David began to realize the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe he had created. When he measured the radiation levels with his Geiger counter, the numbers were absolutely terrifying. The device was emitting lethal amounts of radiation, and the wooden potting shed offered absolutely no protection. He knew he desperately needed to insert control rods to slow down the nuclear reaction, but he had absolutely no idea how to build or implement them. The homemade core was completely unregulated, and an invisible wave of deadly radiation was silently flooding his peaceful, unsuspecting neighborhood. Panicking and finally realizing that he was in way over his head, David decided he needed to dismantle the reactor and figure out his next move. At around 2:40 in the morning, overwhelmed by the horrifying reality of his creation, he loaded some of the most highly radioactive materials into the trunk of his car. He drove off into the dead of night, hoping to clear his head and find a way to fix his colossal mistake. But luck, which had seemingly protected him from blowing his own arms off for years, was no longer on his side. A local police patrol noticed a lone car driving slowly and erratically through the quiet, dark suburban streets. Suspicious of the strange behavior at such a late hour, the officers decided to pull him over for a routine check when the police approached the vehicle and eventually asked to search it. They opened the trunk and were met with a bizarre collection of sealed containers and strange equipment. David immediately panicked and warned the officers to step back, confessing that the equipment inside was highly radioactive. The police officers, completely bewildered but sufficiently alarmed by the teenager's strange and urgent warning, immediately called for backup. What started as a simple, routine traffic stop for a suspicious teenager wandering the streets quickly escalated into a full-blown national security incident. The car was cautiously examined by elite bomb disposal squads, and once they realized it was not a conventional explosive device, the true, unimaginable horror of the situation began to set in. The materials sitting casually in the trunk of a teenager's car were emitting massive, dangerous amounts of radiation. This horrifying discovery immediately triggered the Federal Radiological Emergency Response Plan. David's late-night drive had managed to mobilize the FBI, the Department of Energy, and various public health officials from the State Department. The teenager was promptly arrested and taken into custody, but he stubbornly refused to answer any of their questions. He was absolutely terrified of the legal and personal consequences, choosing to remain completely silent, especially regarding the toxic wooden shed sitting in his mother's backyard. The authorities were at a loss until a radiology expert named Dave was brought in to interrogate the silent teenager. Rather than using aggressive tactics, Dave took a friendly, mentor-like approach, impressing David with his deep professional knowledge of chemistry and radioactivity. This psychological strategy worked perfectly on the isolated, obsessive boy. After a long conversation, David finally broke down and confessed absolutely everything. He told the authorities about his secret laboratory, the stolen smoke detectors, the radium clocks, and the fully functioning nuclear reactor core sitting right in the middle of a residential neighborhood. The authorities immediately rushed to seal off the shed. But during the critical time it took to get David to confess, another disaster had occurred. His mother, entirely terrified that her son's dangerous experiments would result in him being locked away in federal prison forever, had panicked. In a misguided attempt to protect him, she secretly gathered up most of the highly radioactive materials, including the actual working reactor core itself, and threw them directly into the regular household trash. She had unknowingly scattered lethal, unshielded radioactive waste into the public sanitation system. By the time the federal hazmat teams arrived, the core was gone. However, the shed and the surrounding area were still profoundly contaminated, requiring a massive, incredibly expensive cleanup operation to neutralize a severe threat that had endangered the lives of roughly 40,000 local residents. 36 sealed barrels of radioactive waste were removed from the property and distributed to disposal facilities in the Great Salt Lake Desert, buried alongside industrial atomic waste. The sheer scale of the disaster caused by one teenager was unprecedented. The descent into absolute madness was no longer just a theoretical concept. It was a physical reality sitting right in the middle of a quiet suburban backyard. David Hahn had successfully gathered an unholy trinity of radioactive elements. He had his americium, his radium, and his highly purified thorium. But to truly achieve a sustained nuclear reaction, to build the neutron gun he had been obsessing over, he needed a way to control and slow down the neutrons. In a professional, multi-billion-dollar government facility, scientists use heavy water or highly specialized graphite to achieve this delicate balance. But David was a teenager working in a wooden potting shed. Water was entirely too safe, too boring, and frankly, too ordinary for his grand, terrifying vision. Instead, he turned his attention to local gun shops. Using the last remnants of his fast food wages, he began buying up specialized, glow-in-the-dark gun sights. He meticulously dismantled them to extract the tiny amounts of tritium and beryllium hidden inside. He took these incredibly dangerous materials and carefully positioned them directly in front of his radium source. This crude, highly unstable combination acted as an accelerant, triggering a massive rapid spike in radioactivity. He was no longer just playing with dangerous chemicals. He was actively manipulating the fundamental building blocks of the universe, forcing them to tear themselves apart. With his makeshift neutron source complete, David moved on to the final apocalyptic stage of his project. He mixed his radioactive elements together, wrapping them tightly in standard, everyday aluminum foil. This glowing, toxic package became his primary nuclear fuel. He then surrounded this fuel core with a volatile mixture of thorium and uranium powder, wrapping the entire deadly concoction in even more aluminum foil. And how did this teenage mastermind secure the core of his homemade nuclear reactor? How did he seal this terrifying engine of destruction? He used duct tape. Yes, standard, hardware-stored duct tape. With that final, absurd touch, David Hahn had successfully completed a functional nuclear reactor core in his mother's backyard. He had actually achieved the impossible. But the thrill of his dark victory was incredibly short-lived. When David finally brought his Geiger counter close to the duct-taped core, the machine did not just click. It screamed. The radiation levels were absolutely off the charts, registering at a terrifying, lethal intensity. The invisible, silent wave of nuclear energy was easily penetrating the thin wooden walls of the shed, flooding out into the serene, unsuspecting neighborhood. For the very first time in his life, the sheer magnitude of his absolute recklessness crashed down upon him. He realized with horrifying clarity that he had created a monster he could not contain. In a real nuclear power plant. A reactor is managed using heavy control rods that absorb excess neutrons and prevent a catastrophic meltdown. David desperately knew he needed control rods to slow down the violent reaction he had started, but he had absolutely no idea how to build them. His reactor was running completely wild, unregulated, and incredibly dangerous. Panic, a cold and suffocating panic, finally gripped the boy who had once thought himself invincible. He realized he had to dismantle the core and hide the evidence before he inadvertently killed himself and everyone living within a several-mile radius. In the dead of night, at roughly 2:40 in the morning, David frantically began to dismantle his laboratory. Overwhelmed by the horrifying reality of what he had done, he loaded the most highly radioactive materials, including the core itself, into the trunk of his car. He drove off into the silent, dark streets of the suburb, desperate to clear his head and figure out how to dispose of his colossal, glowing mistake. But the unbelievable luck that had kept him from blowing his own arms off for years had finally run out. A local police patrol, cruising through the quiet neighborhood, noticed a lone car driving incredibly slowly and erratically. Suspicious of this strange, nervous behavior at such a late hour, the officers flipped on their flashing lights and pulled the teenager over for what they assumed would be a routine traffic stop. When the officers approached the vehicle, they found a sweating, terrified teenager. They asked to search the car, and when they popped open the trunk, they were met with a bizarre, chaotic collection of sealed containers, strange powders, and duct-taped packages. David panicked completely. He backed away and urgently warned the officers not to touch anything, confessing that the equipment inside the trunk was highly radioactive. The police officers were completely bewildered. They were expecting to find stolen goods or illegal narcotics, not a mobile nuclear hazard. Sufficiently alarmed by the teenager's strange and desperate warning, they immediately stepped back and called for backup. What had started as a simple, mundane traffic stop escalated in a matter of minutes into a full-blown national security crisis. The car was cautiously surrounded and examined by elite bomb disposal squads. Once the experts realized it was not a conventional explosive device, but rather a massive source of lethal radiation, the true, unimaginable horror of the situation began to set in. The materials sitting casually in the trunk of a teenager's car were emitting such dangerous levels of radioactivity that it immediately triggered the Federal Radiological Emergency Response Plan. David's panicked midnight drive had managed to mobilize the FBI, the Department of Energy, and various public health officials. The teenager was promptly arrested, handcuffed, and taken into federal custody. Yet, despite the overwhelming force of the United States government bearing down on him, David remained completely, stubbornly silent, terrified of the consequences of revealing the true nightmare still sitting in his mother's backyard. The interrogation room was suffocatingly quiet. David Hahn, a teenage boy who had single-handedly triggered a national security crisis, sat handcuffed and completely silent. Facing him were seasoned FBI agents and officials from the Department of Energy, all grappling with an unprecedented terror. They knew the boy had highly radioactive materials in the trunk of his car, but they had absolutely no idea about the true scale of the nightmare waiting back in his mother's suburban yard. David, terrified of spending the rest of his life in a federal prison, stubbornly refused to utter a single word. The federal authorities were hitting a brick wall. They needed answers, and they needed them immediately, before an invisible radioactive cloud could claim any more victims. Realizing that aggressive interrogation tactics were useless against a panicked teenager, the authorities brought in a radiology expert named Dave Mann. Dave understood that David was not a malicious terrorist. He was a brilliant, albeit catastrophically reckless, scientist. Taking a friendly, mentor-like approach, Dave sat down with the boy and simply began to talk about chemistry. He stroked David's ego, discussing the complexities of isolating isotopes and radioactive decay. This psychological strategy worked flawlessly. Feeling understood for the first time in his life, David's defenses crumbled. He opened up and proudly confessed absolutely everything. He detailed the stolen smoke detectors, the radium clocks, the lithium batteries, and finally, the terrifying masterpiece, the fully functional nuclear reactor core, sitting inside a fragile wooden potting shed. While this dramatic confession was unfolding in a sterile interrogation room, an entirely different kind of catastrophe was taking place back at the house. David's mother had realized her son was in federal custody. Gripped by a blinding, irrational panic, she became terrified that the dangerous experiments in her backyard would result in her son being locked away forever. In a misguided and horrifyingly dangerous attempt to protect him, she snuck into the highly contaminated shed. Without wearing any protective gear, she grabbed the most radioactive materials, including the actual duct-taped reactor core itself, and threw them directly into the regular household garbage. She had unknowingly scattered lethal, unshielded radioactive waste into the public sanitation system that by the time the federal hazmat teams descended upon the quiet suburban neighborhood, stepping out of their armored vehicles in full, heavy radiation suits, the core was already gone. However, the shed itself and the surrounding yard were profoundly contaminated. The Environmental Protection Agency had to initiate a massive cleanup operation, offering a $90,000 compensation fund to the workers brave enough to handle the toxic debris. They painstakingly dismantled the wooden shed piece by piece. 36 sealed barrels of highly radioactive waste were removed from that ordinary backyard. These barrels were loaded onto secure transports and driven across the country to the Great Salt Lake Desert, where they were buried deep underground alongside industrial atomic weapons waste. The cleanup was successful, but the invisible damage was already done. It was estimated that nearly 40,000 residents in the surrounding area had been exposed to dangerous levels of radiation. David was eventually released, but the psychological and physical toll of his bizarre experiment had permanently shattered his world. Shortly after he returned to society, his mother, unable to cope with the overwhelming stress and the fallout of the incident, tragically took her own life. This devastating loss plunged David into a deep, inescapable depression. Desperately searching for structure and a renewed sense of purpose, he joined the military, serving in both the United States Navy and the Marine Corps. However, the shadow of his past refused to let him go. Wherever he went, he was followed by his infamous moniker, the Radioactive Boy Scout. The military provided temporary stability, but it could not cure his underlying obsession. Years passed, but David's mind remained fixated on the periodic table. In 1995, a decade after the initial incident, authorities received a tip and swarmed his residence again, fearing he had built another reactor. The threat was deemed so severe that the entire neighborhood was evacuated for 5 hours, though police ultimately found insufficient evidence to charge him. But David could not stop. In 2007, the radioactive Boy Scout was arrested once again. The charge? Stealing dozens of smoke detectors to harvest americium. When police raided his apartment this time, they didn't just find stolen alarms. They discovered that David was writing a book about his homemade reactor, hoping to promote his dangerous experiments and secure funding to continue his research. He was sentenced to 90 days in prison. For a mind already stretched to its absolute limits, this final incarceration was the breaking point. After his release, David's mental health deteriorated entirely. Unable to legally obtain the materials he craved, he turned his obsessive chemistry skills toward a darker path, creating and consuming powerful, unverified chemical combinations to numb his pain. His body, already battered by years of severe radiation exposure and psychological trauma, simply could not endure anymore. At the remarkably young age of 39, David Hahn passed away. It was a tragically quiet end for a boy whose unchecked genius had once commanded the attention of the FBI, the EPA, and the entire world. One cannot help but wonder if this brilliant, neglected child had been guided into a proper university laboratory instead of a wooden shed. What incredible positive discoveries might he have given to humanity?